don't ever sit on top of the ridge and look down into the gap. I mean, I guess you can do that. You always hunt where the sign is. Don't hunt where you think they're going to cross. Hunt where the sign's telling you they're going to cross. That's part of woodsmanship, learning how to read sign. A lot of people sit in the gap and watch it. And yeah, if you sit there long enough, you'll have one cross it. But more times than not, they're funneling down the sides of the ridge, and they'll come under the gap. So a lot of times you have to, if the ridge is wide, you'll have to pick one side or the other to sit on.
How do you begin to take such a huge area and break it down in more bite-sized chunks to actually go and start finding deer? Like, where do you get started on 1,000,000 acres?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I challenge myself to find, I call them honey hole stands, A stands, where I can go every year and depend on killing a nice buck. I challenge myself to finding at least one every year. And that doesn't sound very hard, but it is. When you factor in family, work, you got to spend time scouting. You'll spend several trips and lots of miles walking. You'll burn a lot of boot leather to find just one of these stands. I challenge myself to find one a year. And what I do is, let's just say I want to pick a new WMA that I haven't hunted. Let's just say if I wanted to hunt Charlie Brown WMA. It's not a Charlie Brown, but just for example.
I was like, don't say the name of it.
Right, I almost did. Dude. Almost name dropped. It was on the tip of my tongue, man. But what I'll do is I'll start studying topo maps, old school topo maps. I'll buy the paper, the old paper version. You can still find them. I'll spread it on the table, and I'll spend hours and hours studying, walking ridge lines, finding benches, finding gaps. In the mountains, you usually don't hunt many creek bottoms usually. That's usually more of a Piedmont thing because the creek bottoms in the mountains are generally poor habitat for deer. There's nothing down there for them except thickets. But no, I'll start studying topo maps. And what I like to find generally is, 8 or 10 places that are worth scouting, and then go scouting. I'll start eliminating areas. There's a lot of unproductive land. We got a lot of land, but a lot of it's not productive for deer. And what I look for is where you got 3 or 4 big ridges coming together, 3 or 4 leads. On the maps, they're named knobs. You don't hear a lot of people talk about knobs. I've had a lot of luck on knobs. You got 3 or 4 leads. Every one of these leads may have 1 or 2 horn trees and maybe a faintly used deer trail. But when the sum of all them come together on that knob, your odds will go way up. Go ahead.
Well, and to clarify on that, we're talking about knobs, that high point, we talked about almost like the center of a hub of a wheel.
Topo hub.
And then you have all the big ridges coming off that high spot, that knob. And that knob, the center point of that hub of the wheel, you could say, is the focal area where all those deer are going to probably cross through.
That's correct, yeah. Now, do you get on top of the knob? Usually not. But you get off one of them sides, where you can view 2 or 3 of them leads coming together. And it doesn't, a topo map's important because it would be hard to identify that if you're just walking through there, unless you spend a really great amount of time in there. Nowadays we got cell phones. Boy, if I'd had a cell phone when I was young and in shape, hey, by the way, I'm 44 now, and I don't walk in the mountains as good as I once did, but second-class mail still gets delivered, right? So I get there. It's just on my time. But you can ping yourself on these phones, and you can see exactly where you're at. So if you look at a topo map, you think, yeah, I'm probably here. But now you can ping yourself, and you can confirm or deny that real quick, which is nice. And with cell service, it's usually good up top. Down in the holes, down in the creek, it's spotty, but on top of the mountain, there's usually now these days you got decent enough service. But one thing I look for is where several leads come together and form a knob, and then from there, you don't hunt the top of the knob. A deer's almost never going to go over it. But you can get around, walk around it, and then do semicircles going downhill until you find where the trails are and kind of figure them out. And you just got to use good judgment on where to set up. It sometimes isn't the best place you can see. Oftentimes it's not. Most of the time it's not. You want to find those trails that run just like you would in Middle Georgia, or if you're hunting in the Piedmont where you're hunting the edge of, maybe where the big pines meet the little pines or the pines meet the hardwoods. You can still find, lines of laurel thicket. We call them laurel thickets, rhododendron thicket. Everybody calls them laurel, but a lot of times them deer, they'll run the edge of them laurel thickets just like they run the edge of a pine thicket in South Georgia. So that's one thing I look for. Another big topo feature I look for is gaps. So a gap is you got a ridge line. None of them are flat, but let's just say, and then there's a depression in the mountain. Well, any game that's going to go through there, they're fighting that constant battle of energy versus food consumption. And, it's the path of least resistance. So pick out 8 or 10 gaps, go walk through them. Sooner or later, you're going to find one that the game's traveling. I've killed a lot of bucks in gaps, killed a lot of bucks on knobs. A lot of times under a gap, by the way, don't ever sit on top of the ridge and look down into the gap. I mean, I guess you can do that. You always hunt where the sign is. Don't hunt where you think they're going to cross. Hunt where the sign's telling you they're going to cross. That's part of woodsmanship, learning how to read sign. A lot of people sit in the gap and watch it. And yeah, if you sit there long enough, you'll have one cross it. But more times than not, they're funneling down the sides of the ridge, and they'll come under the gap. So a lot of times you have to, if the ridge is wide, you'll have to pick one side or the other to sit on. Generally, I pick the sunny side, the morning sunny side of the ridge. You'll generally have more action that way, but sometimes it's not that way. Sometimes you want to hunt, we call it the north side, which is the dark side of the ridge. That's where you get your moss. That's where you get a lot of unproductive trees. The sunny side, you get a lot of red oaks, and that's important during the rut. So that's probably clear as mud, but that's the line of thought I usually take.
There's a lot there, buddy.
So one terminology that you've mentioned, and I was wondering what you were talking about, gaps, because you mentioned gaps in the first 3 minutes of the episode or of this conversation, and what you're calling gaps is what some people would call saddles. Just that low depression on that ridge line that they're sometimes, again, a lot of people think they're crossing it, but a lot of times they're just kind of working the bottom edge of it, especially a buck, because any doe's going through, he can scent check right there.
That's right.
And also, at least in our experience, I'm curious about yours, you find a lot of scrapes in that area and a lot of rubs.
And you do, and this is why. So if you have a gap, by the way, all this sounds easier than it really is. If you have a gap, you're standing at the low point of that section of ridge. That from that gap, it can go up 1,000 feet in elevation on each side or more. So any deer that's on the side of that mountain, no matter what, has to come down by that gap. If you hunt the top of the mountain and you got another 1,000 feet, unless you just guess lucky, you're not going to see that deer. He's either going to come under you or over you. But that gap's going to funnel him down right by you. So, exactly to your point. Yeah, it funnels the deer. It's just a pinch point. I've heard them called pinch point deer funnels. That's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that's going to pinch the deer down to a very specific location.
That's exactly right. And whenever you have that and the deer are down in that specific location, you'll tend to get concentrated sign. That's where they'll put their community scrapes, their post rubs, things of that nature.
And also, by the way, you mentioned for these topo hubs,
explain what that is.
Or what'd you call it?
The knob with the lead ridges.
Yeah. What's your term for that again? What would you call that? Where all the lead ridges come into one spot? You have
on a map you'll see it called a knob or a bald. Same thing. Let's just use. We're not name dropping, but nobody hunts here. Brasstown Bald, the highest point in Georgia.
Okay.
Pull out a topo map, and on that specific lead, you can't hunt it because there's a tower there where people go view. It's like a state park. It's not a state park, but it's a public area. That bald has 2 or 3 leads that come to it, and if you drop down below where people are, you'll find a lot of deer and bear sign.
Okay.
So that would be one specific example you can go look at that, is not really name dropping somebody's honey hole.
So you say a lot of deer sign.
Right.
What does that look like up here in the mountains? Because I'm assuming it's a lot different from in the Piedmont, where you might if I'm comparing it to what I'm used to in Alabama, if I'm on a certain WMA in maybe central Alabama and I find a really good spot, I'm expecting to find dozens and dozens of rubs and possibly dozens and dozens of scrapes.
You'll never find that up here, hardly. Yeah, almost never.
So what's it look like up here?
1 or 2 fresh rubs, and then on top of that 1 or 2 rubs, you'll find 1 or 2 rubs from last year, and ideally 1 or 2 from 100 years ago. You start finding you get an area with multiple years of rubs, and you're looking at an area that has a potential mature buck. So that's what I look for. I never look for I've never found a quantity of sign really. It's almost, it is so rare to find an area where it's got 8 or 10 scrapes and 20 or 30 horn trees. If you go through 1 million acres, is there somewhere out there that has it? I'm sure, but it's rare. I look for fresh sign. I look for big fresh sign, but I'm expecting to not find much of it. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, keep going.
All right. So your game trails on tops of these ridges, if people who are new to the mountains, they tend to stick to the tops of the ridges, and that's fine. If you do it enough, you'll kill something, but you'll find wide, flat trails on these ridge tops. Those are not deer. Those are bears. Bears walk them tops. If you want to find deer sign, you get off on the sides, and you'll find much, much more narrow trails that skirt the sides of these ridges, and the leaves are chopped up. That's deer and hogs. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. On the trails alone, yeah, but hogs you'll generally find rooting. So if you find chopped up leaves, no rooting, and you start finding a few rubs, you're getting there, and you may already be there.
Man, that one little detail, like I don't want people to miss that. Chopped up leaves, like the leaves are actually like where their hooves are kind of cutting them up.
That's right. That's
as
exactly
opposed to
right.
like a bear's foot, their pads like mashing them down, right?
A bear trail looks like a human hiking trail. It's wide and it's flat. The leaves are matted down flat, and yeah, that's bears.
That's what you call woodsmanship, kids. That's what I'm talking about. That's awesome, man.